Hello everyone and welcome to week 9. This week we are going to be going over forms in JavaScript and something called regular expressions, which we're just going to ever so briefly touch on, and then I'm going to tell y'all a little life hack, and then that'll be it for the week. So let's get started. Alright, so forms. So last term we talked about the HTML for forms, so that's like the front end. JavaScript covers both like the client-side validation of data, but also does things that help with you can actually use them with NoSQL databases for interfacing with those. Depending on the type of setup that you're using, you can use them to talk with databases, but they're also really helpful for just like basic user interface with our browser-based forms. So let's kind of look at what we look at with events with forms in JavaScript. And in general, when you're working with a form in JavaScript, there are 3 types of events that we're normally concerned with. The first is like toggling between elements. So either, like a mouse movement away or using tab between. And then data being changed between elements or within an element. So like users clicking a checkbox or putting in text into a text box. I think I said checking a text box. I meant checking a checkbox. Or like movement between radio buttons. And then finally submitting the form, which is another form of data being changed within a form element, because your submit button is considered an input, but it is a very special kind of input, right? So let's take a look at that a little bit more in depth. All right, so first up, let's look at the first thing that we were concerned with, which was moving between elements, right? So when you move between a form, between form elements, you have 2 very specific event listeners that you're using. And so those are focus and blur. And we kind of talked about those last week, right? So focus is when you are on an element. So if it is a text box or text area, it is when your cursor is in that element. Same thing with check buttons and radio buttons, or drop down when you're like actively interacting with those. And then a blur is when you move from that element to something else, right? So what's cool with movement elements in JavaScript is you can do some really simple things to help your users know where they are in your form. If you took my class last term, we read the Don't Make Me Think, and this is one of those things that kind of helps our users not think. So by doing something like changing the background color of where you're at in the form when you're focused on it, that lets that user know, hey, okay, I'm here right now, right? So how do we do this? Well, we have to add an event listener, and we add it after the DOM is loaded, because, can't affect a thing before the thing exists, right? We've been talking about that a lot. So after the thing is loaded, you can look for focus events and blur events on target divs. The way that you can do that is normally you group all of your fields with the same class, or you can do it like they're doing here. They did it by input type text or input type password. So you can also target them directly by input types. If you do it by tagging them all with the same class, then you can do the same kind of thing where you select all with a query select all and then iterate through them, like f of whatever. And then you add the event listeners for focus or blur. And then normally the way to do it is to, so in the top example here, they have added a style and then are adding and removing a style. But as we've talked about previously, it's better if you're going to be using something over and over and over again to set it up as a class so that you can just toggle on that class, right? So, yeah, in this example, it doesn't show fully. Oh, no, it does. The set background above is adding and removing a style, but the way I would do it is adding or removing a class that was like focus or not focus, right? Or active. Active is one that you see a lot in there. So you add the active class, it does the thing, and then on blur, it does the other thing, right? It takes it back. Okay. So, focus and blur. So just kind of keep those in mind. Those are for moving between elements. But what do we do when somebody changes an element? So entering text into that text box, selecting something within that radio button, selecting something from a drop-down list, and what you do is you target those event listeners, and what the example here is explaining that you can change the elements of one of the form fields based on the user input of another field, right? So think about some forms that you've seen in the past, like maybe if you have a form that's like, do you want to be contacted by email or phone? Then if you select phone, then it's going to pop up with a field for your phone number. If you do email, it pops up with a field for your email. Or if you put in like your zip code or something, and then it changes the availability of your cities. Or in this example here, it's got, a country between Europe and United States, and then, no, sorry, your payment type. So if you do Bitcoin, it's going to pop up with one, and then PayPal is going to pop up with a different. So let's, it doesn't actually show it here. So let me go ahead and bring up the book because it's kind of important. So this is in chapter 9 where we are. We are in the later third of chapter 9. Why does my mouse keep going away? Alrighty. Good to know. Okay. You gonna load, buddy? No, you're not. Okay, there we go. So, oh no, this loaded in chapter 10. Well, thank you all for sticking around while I fiddle with this. Kind of annoying, but okay. So, let me biggerize this. What we've got here is we've got a label on these for your payment label and then payment type. And then it's listening to each of the radio buttons here, where it's got that constant radio is weird. Okay, so it's got the constant of radios, which is going to be the array for all of the radio buttons that have an input name, which remember you have a name and you have an input with an input name of region. And then we're iterating through them, which just means stepping through them and saying, hey, for all of those, we're going to add this event lister for change. Okay? So change is the event listener like click, but for when the value changes. So when the you got your name value pair, your label input pair, when your value changes. So it's saying that we are if it is not selected, we're setting it to false, and then we are changing the inner HTML. So instead of building an element, this one's changing the inner HTML, and then we're adding options. Okay, so we've got an if-else statement here that is set by the choice of what the person is putting in. So the value, the target value, that's our value. We're setting it to a variable called choice and saying if the choice is United States, then, and remember your double equals is for when you're using like strings and things that need to equal that separate kind of equals. Sorry, this is not terribly clear. So it's a compare versus a true false. No, it's still a true false. It's comparing the data versus the data location. So if you use the one equal signs, it's comparing the location. If you use the double, then it's comparing the value, basically. So if the choice is United States, then we are going to remove the class list for euro, which is the type of currency they use, and add for dollar, and then add these 3 payment types. So these 2 class lists are your symbols for currency. So one's the dollar symbol, one's the euro symbol. And then your options is adding that into the drop-down list. It would show American Express, MasterCard, and Visa as the labels, and then the value is 1, 2, 3. Same thing if it was Europe, then it's going to remove the dollar symbol, add the euro symbol, and then your 2 payment types, the label would be Bitcoin, value would be 4, label PayPal, value 5. And then the last thing you do is define this function right here. And this is where it's creating the elements for it. So this should look kind of semi-familiar. This is on page 459 of your book. We're not going to do any sort of like projects with forms because we've kind of done that already in last term, and we still don't have anything to actually like store that data or do anything truly useful with it. So I don't feel like it's a good use of your time to do projects with that. So this is another time where it's just like, okay, I know what these things kind of mean, even though I've not used them. All right. So, form validation, super duper important for JavaScript. It is basically, think about when you've put in like a password and it's like, oh, okay, we need to have 9 letters and 1 special character and a number in there. Or if you put in an email and it's like, okay, you need to put in a valid email. JavaScript is doing that. Or whatever backend you're using for your form. So, like, this slide here is, we're going to talk about the validation, but the big point of this slide is that you can do some validation beforehand using your JavaScript on the front end, before you send your form to your server and have the server-side validation. And that means that your server is not getting hit as bad with a bunch of people putting in bad information, because we're kind of filtering that down on the front end. And then the common validation activities are email, like I said, number, so things like phone number. I've used it before on my KCC for student ID number. Make sure you have 6 digits, starts with a whatever, and then data validation. And the last thing we're going to talk about today, it uses regular expressions to a lot of times to make these validation checks. And we'll get to that in just a minute. This is a pretty short lecture this week. Okay. So, this would be an example of data validation. So what this is it's checking if the field is empty. And we do that through checking if the value is null or if the value is empty. So to kind of break down the scripting here. So we've got a form that's, well, a variable called form that's going out and grabbing something with an ID of login form. We're adding an event listener when somebody hits the submit button. Like I said, that very specific activity event, not activity. That's when they're hitting that submit button. And then this is using arrow notation. So this is an anonymous function that's using that event object and doing this thing. And the thing that it's doing, it's creating a variable called field value that's going to be everything that is in the field. No, it's just one thing because it's a query selector. So that one thing that has the ID of username and the value of it, right? And then it's saying if the field value, so that thing with the ID of username, if it is null, which means that if it has not been touched at all, or if it is empty. So the way that we check for empty is just two either single double quotes just right next to each other. It is not the same if you put quote space quote, because there's a space in there, and a space has a like in HTML it has a symbol, in Unicode there's a space is its own separate thing, so it's got to have nothing in between those two quotes. Okay. So then if it is empty or null, then do this thing where it's prevent default. So we talked about that last week or the week before. And prevent default stops the default action of whatever the event is. In this case, stops the form from being submitted, and then pops up in the console that you must enter a username. If this was an actual one, it would most likely pop up an alert that's like, you must enter a username. Or a lot of times we use a toggleable like div, like doing display none versus display. That's like, hey, this is the error. But in this case, it's using console log. Okay. Oh, I beg your unbelievable pardon. Y'all, I am having a time today. Okay. And then it just popped up with we'd love your feedback from PowerPoint. No, I can bet you would not. Alright. So, that was an example of an empty field validation. This is an example of checking what is selected for a multi-select. So, multi-select are things like checkboxes, and then there's like some drop downs that you can select multiple. In general, it's better to use like a checkbox for it because it's built for that. And the way that it uses those is through a list item. So like an array. So what we've got here is a variable called multi that is going through and grabbing the ID of list box, and then instead of, like, you're still going to use values, but with multi-selects you got to use options first. And so it's going through a for loop where it's saying, you know, for basically all of the length of the number of options that is within this thing with the ID of list box, do this thing. So, you know, let I equal 0, we're setting up our iterator. Do this as long as I is less than the length of the options array, and then iterate I each time. And then it's saying with this, if multi.options I is dot selected, it's saying if, when we're iterating through, the option at index of I is selected, do this thing. Okay? So this iterates through all of the options. It checks them whether or not they are selected. That's what that for loop does. And then the if filters it down to just the ones that are selected, and then does something with those. There is an option for if you want to just get the ones that were selected, and that is the dot selected options. So instead of doing the for and then if, you just do a for, and instead of the multi dot options, you do multi dot selection options. And then you still have to grab the index of them each time. That's what that square brackets I is. That means index. That means, you know, in your array, starting at 0, the comma separates each of them. Whatever one you're at that one, do it. Okay? Alright. Number validation. So when you are using a library like jQuery, or you use a different language, number validation is a little bit easier because they have those built in, because that's, you know, kind of the function of a library. But you can do number validation in here in JavaScript. So the first thing you got to do is check if it is a number. And the way that you do that is you do that by using a combination of parse int, which means take this string and act like it's an integer, which is a number. Integers can't be negative, I believe. Been a long time since math, you know. Is NaN, which is not a number. So that's checking whether or not it is a number. And then is finite, which means that it is not a infinitely repeating, like pi. Pi is an infinitely repeating number. Like no imaginary numbers in there, that kind of thing. So the function down here is checking if something is numeric, so checking if something is a number. It's passing through something, so that in is just passing through some sort of value. And then it's returning it. So this exclamation point here is not. So it stands for not, right? So you have and, or, not in terms of logic for programming. So this means not, or is false, that kind of thing. So it's saying return not is not a number. So is not a number returns true if it's not a number, right? So we want it to be false if it's a number, which I know seems kind of silly. So if it is not a number, then it's a number. And then parse float, which a float has decimal points versus an integer being like a whole number. And the double ampersands means and. is finite, which means that it's not repeating. Is this something you have to remember? No, but this is just, in most libraries, it's done this for you. It's written this out so that you can check that. And then for validating things like email, well, we're talking about numbers here, but validating things like phone numbers, social security numbers, you're going to use that, is blank one that we looked at. You're going to use something like this to check if it is numeric. And then you're also going to do some other checks. So we know that social security numbers have a certain length, so we can check for length. Same with phone numbers, we can check for those. Now we can't check whether or not it actually exists, but you can do some simple checks to check. Man, I've said check too much. You can do some simple checks to make sure that it is a plausible answer. Alright, so that's some basic validation. So you can check for blanks, you can check whether or not things are selected. This validation is how you make sure required items are filled out. So if something is required, you basically just make sure that it's not null or not blank, right? And then number validation to check if it's a number. Alright. Last thing we're going to talk about with forms is submitting forms. Okay? So, submitting a form, all you have to do is call the submit method. Okay? So, basically, you can either do the, add an event listener of on-click submit. You can tag it as a submit. Or you can do something like this right here, where you go in, grab it, and then submit it. Why you might do something like this, where you go in, grab it, and then submit it, versus just submitting it when somebody clicks it, is because, and I'm sure you've had this happen, sometimes people like to click the submit button multiple times because they don't think that anything is happening, and you don't want it to submit more than once. So by using a very, in conjunction with the .submit method, you can do, you can disable the submit button, and then you can, if the form is submitted already, do a prevent default on that submit button to stop it from happening again. So, in general, once you hit that submit button, there's some sort of logic in there that either hides that submit button so you can't click it again, or there's some sort of routing to take you to a thank you page, or it does something like this to where it just kind of turns it off. But just know that if you don't have that sort of logic on there and you have a submit button, you can submit a bunch. Alright. So let's talk about regular expressions, otherwise known as RegEx. RegEx is basically a pattern recognition standard. So, RegEx actually predates the web, and it is supported by every programming language that I can think of. Okay. So the way that RegEx works is that there are two types of characters. a literal, and a meta character. So a literal is what you're matching against, right? So if you are wanting to check for like an email, you would be checking against that it has maybe the @ symbol in it, right? Or you can't really do a dot, but you could check for things like com or edu or org. And then there's a meta character. So there's 14 meta characters, and those are basically your commands for it. So, you know how I've been telling you all to not memorize this? If you ever talk to anyone who says that they can write RegEx without some sort of help, be that like there's a lot of websites out there that'll help you write it because they've got all the commands stored in there, they're lying. I have never met a person who's like, oh yeah, I can just read and understand everything RegEx all the time. So don't worry if this sounds a little crazy. All right. So let me bring up table 9.12. So this is a little less esoteric here. RegEx, that's empty fields. Submitting. Okay. So these are the different patterns, right? And they're all logic-based patterns. They are looking for, does it match this? So the first one is the caret and then the $sign, and anything between those two is what you're checking against, right? So everything between those two has to match. /t matches a tab character. /n matches a new line, which is your enter. A period matches anything other than a new line character. The brackets match any single character of the set. So in this example here, it has QWERTY. So if any of those characters show up, it's going to show up as a match. The opposite is true of the one right below it. So if you have the brackets and then the caret, it matches anything not within those brackets. So, you know, if you had an A or a C or any letter that's not Q, W, E, T, or Y. And then A to Z matches a character within a range of characters. /W matches a word. Now I want you to notice here that they are case specific. So /w matches any word character, which is basically checking for clumps of characters with white space surrounding them. /W is for any non-word. /S, and I believe this is a misprint in here. This should be a capital S. So these are white space digits. The asterisk is 0 or more. So asterisk will catch it even if it doesn't match. Plus is 1 or more matches, so it has to match at least 1. And then this is our OR character. It either has to match 0 or 1. And then these are ways to make it match more than that. Like you want at least this many, but not more than that many. And then these are ways to add extra terms, and then this is a sub-expression. So, so this one and the one that you saw right before it are kind of the ones I use. So you can create your regular expressions here, and then over on the right, it's got our lovely little handy dandy shorthands. So, and then explainers. So let's say we want it to match, like cat, right? So we want it to match, you could do CT. What does that do? Well, does that match cat? Yes, because it's got the A in it. Does it match catch? Yeah. What about actor? Yep, matches that. So you got to be really careful about it. Now, let's hop back to the syntax, and then I will give you my little life hack. Okay. So, regular expressions are case sensitive and contained within forward slashes. So, like the example I was showing you here, it's setting a variable to a pattern of /ran/, and it looks for that particular pattern. So it'll find matches in Randy Colonelly, because it's got ran in that, and then Susan ran to the store, and then I would like a cranberry. 9.13 has more complex ones if you're interested in it. Okay. So this is one checking for 0 to 8 non-space characters. This is password one. So it's saying, you know, you can use any characters from A to Z, uppercase A to Z. It must be between 8 and 16 characters, but no more. And then it's contained within those brackets. So, these are on page 468. If you want to look at them. But here's your life hack, okay? Have you all heard of ChatGPT? If you can, and if you end up using RegEx, ChatGPT is going to be your best friend. That's fine. You can say, can you please write me a RegEx for checking for a password containing 8 to 16 characters, one special character, and one number. There you go. So, I wouldn't trust ChatGPT to write your code for you if you don't know what you're doing, because unless you're extremely explicit in what you tell it, it's going to assume a lot of things. But for things like regular expressions, it's great, because it's just pattern matching and pattern recognition. So let's take this here, and let's go back over to our RegEx 101 here. Okay, so we've got this regular expression. So if we break it down, this is the start, this is the end. It has to be between 8 and 16 characters. it has to have a digit in it somewhere. And these are just sub-expressions, right? It has to have a special character in it. And the reason that these are in brackets is because otherwise some of these characters are used within the controls of RegEx itself. And then it has to have something between, it can have anything within this A to Z, capital A to Z. So let's see here. I'm going to say cat 1, 2, 3. Doesn't match, right? Let's say this is a password. So, works for that because we've got between 0 to 16. We've got your special character with the @ symbol, and then we've got your 1. So make sure you do your testing, and obviously don't like write your essays or whatever with ChatGPT, but I am 100% in favor of using it to help make your programming easier with stuff like RegEx. And then that is actually all the lovely lecture that I have today for y'all. We've gone over forms, we've gone over RegEx, we've done a little tiny example of ChatGPT. If you have any questions, let me know. Again, we have our discussion board on Canvas, and we've only got like this week and 2 weeks left. So I hope you all are doing good. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.